I'm Allison Morris, and I'm the security correspondent and columnist with the Irish News. And this is the Féile on Football Talk, Why Doesn't She Just Leave? A look at how the North's legislation is letting women and children down. And with me today are my two panellists.
Sinead Larkin, family law partner with Larkin Cassidy Solicitors, and I'm a family law specialist with almost 25 years experience in the area of children order and domestic proceedings.
I'm Sonya McMullan, Regional Services Manager for Women's Aid Federation here in Northern Ireland. And I've worked in Women's Aid for over 20 years, also previously managing the 24-hour domestic and sexual violence helpline.
And we're just coming out of a period of quite severe lockdown. And as part of that, I have interviewed quite a few police officers who have told me that crime was down across the board, apart from domestic violence, in which calls had skyrocketed, especially in those first early weeks of lockdown. Sonya, what sort of challenges has that presented Women's Aid with in terms of trying to protect women who were living maybe in abusive households during that time?
The challenges were a lot because our work in Women's Aid, a lot of it is face-to-face. You have that person, in front of you, and everything changed straight away. But interestingly, where the numbers increased in relation to the helpline service and in relation to the police, the calls coming through to Women's Aid dropped, because that pathway to support was not as accessible, given, you couldn't walk into an advice centre. Schools and safeguarding referrals as well, decreased too. And whenever we spoke to other domestic violence sectors across the rest of the UK and indeed in the South, it was exactly the same for an awful lot of those services. A lot of our refuges were full, so we kept the families in that were in and did an awful lot of risk assessment, but everything changed immediately with regard to new referrals coming in. So we worked very closely with the police and the housing executive, looking at emergency crash pads within the accommodation that we had, which was self-contained in 3 different sites. We were able to facilitate that, but really, really challenging. But ultimately, we knew the risk was heightened, and we knew that a lot of women engaged in our services were very, very high risk, because during this period of lockdown, that isolation and quarantining is a perpetrator's dream. Because that's what coercive and controlling behaviour is all about, that isolation. So we were very concerned, but certainly now we're seeing our peak now, and within the next few weeks and months, I think this is whenever we will see, the impact coming through our services.
And Sinead, the courts are obviously a massive part of that, of how women protect themselves through orders, and the courts were closed more or less for business during that time. How difficult did you find it to protect your clients?
Well, I think actually a lot of our experiences run absolutely in tandem with how Sonya has described the experiences of women being in lockdown with the perpetrator. Again, we would usually be able to see our clients directly, and that's very, very important. We pivoted in the legal profession to doing video conference calls. That's very difficult for anybody seeking help, where they are now living cheek by jowl with their abuser. Thankfully, the courts recognised instantly that one of the areas that could not be locked down was access to justice and protective orders. So we were able to use remote hearings, and we had to adjust as a profession. Indeed, the court service had to adjust to that very, very rapidly. And we did see a significant, it certainly from my office, saw a significant rise in the number of non-molestation order applications that we were taking in the first number of weeks of lockdown. That worked relatively successfully, I have to say. We found the system moved quite seamlessly. The courts adapted to not having our clients sign their statements of evidence. We were able to have our clients sworn in via video link, and legal aid also, which is a crucial element. You can't underestimate the importance of legal aid in progressing cases for people who need assistance. And they also moved to not having that level of bureaucracy that we would normally see with legal aid applications, to granting applications almost within a number of hours without signatures. So these things were all put in place. It did relatively smoothly, but we certainly did see an increase in the number of applications that we were seeing coming through our virtual door.
And the lack of the face-to-face contact. I've been quite public about my own situation, and I had to have a non-molestation order due to the stalking that was going on with my ex-partner. And I remember very clearly the day I walked into your office and asked you to help me, and I was in an awful state that day. And that was so important to me because you were so calm and were able to say to me, look, this is fine. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It'll be grand. And I can't imagine how women who were in that similar situation would have coped not having access to that kind of face-to-face reassurance.
I think what I think was very important was the use of technology. And I fully appreciate what Sonya is saying. Ours is a more narrow remit. But we were able to use Skype and various means of being able, for me, and I appreciate absolutely what you're saying, for me it is extremely important to have face-to-face contact with a client because they need to see your facial gestures, your non-verbal cues to a client are as important as what you say to them. They need to know that you understand what they are going through. And for me, it was very important to instantly move to some form of online facial communication with a client. That has worked very, very well for us. And it has given our clients a lot of comfort because yes, I think clients need to know that you're empathetic, that you understand where they're coming from and that you are their guiding hand through what can be a dreadful process. So yeah,
we know that we have very outdated legislation in terms of dealing with domestic abuse of all kinds. We're the only place on these islands now that doesn't have coercive control legislation, that doesn't have specific stalking legislation. The Justice Minister is trying to progress that quite quickly. Women's Aid have obviously had a role in helping advise and shape on that. How important do you think that new legislation is and what difference will it make?
The new legislation is really important. The last number of weeks we have been really busy. We have sat before the Health Committee, Communities Committee and most importantly the Justice Committee presenting our written evidence and oral evidence to the Committee on the Domestic Abuse Bill. We have had 3 years where we had no assembly and everything stood still. So we had drafted legislation in place, but we had to say to the Department of Justice, sit back here and let's take a little piece of time to reflect. We've waited 3 years, we can wait a little bit longer to make sure that it's right. So parallel to this, the Domestic Abuse Bill is going through Westminster as well as the local assembly. And they have a lot more provisions within that. Really, there's nothing wrong with our legislation. It's great. We welcome it in relation to the coercive controlling behaviours. We want good protections around domestic abuse protection orders and notices, which we don't have. They also have housing provisions going through the Westminster Bill in relation to secure tenancies, which isn't happening. There's also a Domestic Abuse Commissioner, which came into place last year for England and Wales, which we don't have. And we feel at this point in time, it's really crucial to have a commissioner to scrutinise, to oversee, to hold people to account. You know, we have all these reports that come through the Criminal Justice Inspectorate, in 2000, again, 10 years later in 2019, reporting again. And it's the same recommendations. We have the Gillen Review recommendations have just, come out as well. And again, they're the same recommendations that have come in other reports previous. Also a huge one for us is with regard to the family courts. And we would call for a full review of the family courts that they have had in England with regard to specific recommendations, especially in relation to child contact, because domestic violence does not end at that point of separation. And that is crucial. And that abuse can continue through the family courts. So we do welcome the changes. We welcome the swiftness of our Justice Minister pushing through the legislation. But we're also very, very mindful of the mandate of our local assembly at this point. And there's a lot of extra provisions, including the stalking legislation that you were talking about, Alison, as well, that is going to come in later in the year. But, we're going to have consultation on that. And then it's going to take more time, to come out. Another thing we're looking at is fatal and non-fatal strangulation as well. So we have so much work to do. Domestic homicide reviews, they have just recruited for 3 chairs and they're going to do 6 cases as a pilot in the next year. So we welcome that. And that has moved on because it didn't need legislation, which is really good. But if you just look at what we have named in the last few minutes that we don't have, and we are falling so far behind. And the people ultimately that are suffering are the women and children. You know, there's so many people.
In terms of the stalking consultation, I took part in that, but I also had went to interview one of the heads of department while the assembly was collapsed, because obviously the consultation started then. And, you know, they weren't aware of my circumstances at that time and the fact that I was being stalked. And I asked them about the family courts and provisions not allow abusers to use the family courts. And they said, oh, that has never come up. We don't see that that is an issue. So they were conducting a consultation without ever having like experienced, you know, or spoke to people about the different types of stalking. And I think that was the thing for me, is that people think if you're being stalked, someone's showing up outside your work with a bunch of flowers and begging you to take them back. And it is so not that, you know, that is not what it is. As well as that, I found that the police and the training of the PSNI was badly lacking. And I've always said, you know, I used to phone to report an incident and you didn't know what was coming. And during that time, I had seen the good and the bad and the ugly of the PSNI. I seen all kinds. I seen officers who were amazing at their job and some who were a disgrace, you know. And I always say about sitting in my house one day and phoning the police, and a female officer came out and sat down, and her first words to me, what have you done to annoy this boy? You've really wound him up, haven't you? And that was her first words to me. And in the end, I had to ask her to leave my house. And that was how poor the training was in relation to that. And I remember speaking to you about this, Sinead, and you had said that this was just a common factor of the people you deal with, that you don't know what kind of service you get because it's not uniform across the board.
I think the training, and I've been asked about this repeatedly, in terms of it's fine to have legislation. And we've had the Family Homes and Domestic Violence Order in place since 1998. And prior to that, we had the old personal protection orders, which were granted on the basis of threat or use of violence. So the Family Homes and Domestic Violence Order of its time was a revelation, because it broadened the basis on which an applicant could apply. So threatening, harassing, pestering or intimidating behaviour. So harassment, the Oxford English Dictionary definition of that is very broad. But through that, since 1998 and that legislation, the same complaints come up from, and I'm sure, Sonya, you hear this, the same complaints come up as your specific complaint. You can get one police officer that has a great level of understanding and is empathetic, and I think that is key as well. And that doesn't matter what sex you are. But the training is very hit and miss. Quite frequently, it is actually very poor. The level of understanding, it's just a domestic, is what you'll hear. I've rang police officers, and again, I've had the good and the bad. I've had the shirty officer who wonders why you're complaining on behalf of your client. We've had to take complaints as far as the police ombudsman, because the level of basic training in terms of understanding the import of the harassment order, or the harassment legislation, and the Family Homes and Domestic Violence legislation is poor. So one of the key things for me as a practitioner when any new legislation is introduced is training. The police are the people that are frontline implementing this. When I get you a non-molestation order, my control over what happens with that order in terms of its implementation to a large extent ends, save for bringing the application through the court and trusting that the police will enforce it. And as you and I know, that has not always happened, and that is across the board for numerous women. You can advocate very well for yourself.
But I understood the process to a degree, because obviously I'm a crime reporter, and so I understood how the courts worked and how the PPS worked and how those sort of things worked. But I struggled so badly, and I used to think all the time, there's some girl sitting somewhere who doesn't, have the support or the backup that I have trying to get through this. And how would you? It would break you.
Well, on the face of it, you're a strong advocate.
And I had so much support because I had you and I had a good boss and I had a good family, but some people don't have any of those things.
Exactly. And if they are left without somebody supporting them along the way, they are going to get lost in terms of seeking assistance from the police. We, as a group of family lawyers in this jurisdiction, we are very strong in advocacy and looking after our clients, and Women's Aid is there as well. The weak link can quite frequently be those that are tasked with enforcing orders, and that has to be something that the Minister for Justice has to address, and funding.
They do, because the law without training is pointless. I mean, I had, after the first conviction, I got a court-ordered restraining order, and there was numerous occasions when I would have phoned the police to make a complaint, and the officer would have said, that's a civil order, that has nothing to do with us. And I was going, no, it isn't. It was given to me by a magistrate, and trying to even explain to them. They didn't. Sometimes the police officers didn't even understand what the restraining order was.
The thing with all new recruits is they're definitely going to attend a domestic violence incident, and we know that. You know, our training, we do go up to Garnival with the new recruits. It's a very short 45 minutes piece that we do, and we are looking and have been talking to the police about training for a long time. You know, and again looking at those recommendations on those reports that we're talking about. And if we look at England, Scotland, and Wales, for example, there's been an awful lot of investment in their police training with the changes to legislation. And that investment, for example, there's an area of Northumbria, and it would have been where Dame Vera Bird, the Crimes Commissioner, would have been the Crime Commissioner at the time for that area. And she's a Victims of Crime Commissioner now for England and Wales. But the investment they put in and the reduction in the rates of domestic, you know, the investment now can save money, you know, in the future. But with regard to our domestic abuse bill that's going through our local assembly, there's no money or resources attached to it. There's no commitment to that. And that's something that we've brought up time and time again, because we need, as you say, a consistent response. It's okay if you're getting really good response in Fermanagh, but, you know, if you're living in Omagh, it might be different. And that's not fair. And it's not good
We
enough.
have very specific problems here too, related to our conflict, which are important in terms of the fact that there's segregated housing. So if you're trying to rehouse a family, there's certain places they can't go. Also in terms of, you know, paramilitary involvement and coercive control as well. I mean, there were times that in almost all my cases, my abuser was able to go in for voluntary interview and was never arrested, because they told me because where he lived, they would have to send TSG in to arrest him, and so they wouldn't do it because it would cost too much. So in terms of that, he was able to wait 2 weeks, sober up, get an alibi, show up with a solicitor, and no phone. Whereas, you know, if he'd have lived in some, you know, place where they felt that they could send 2 officers in a car, they told me they would arrest him, but they wouldn't arrest him because basically he lived in part of North Belfast, they didn't want to go into.
Yeah, and that's always been an issue, is the service of the orders. And people not knowing if that order has been served. They may be in a refuge and they're waiting to return home, and they just don't know. And so that's something as well that we have raised within the bill with regard to the service of orders. You know, it's still written in the draft legislation that they will be sent by first class post. You know, we want someone to turn up at the door and have a script to let them know the seriousness of this and the consequences, you know, of a breach, for example. And that, you know, doesn't always work. And again, it could be piecemeal and depending on where you live. But again, it is a key recommendation within the criminal justice last 2 inspectorate reports. Very, very clear that the police training, and it will make a difference, you know, and I think there is goodwill there in the police force and the meetings we have, you know, but again, it's about the money, and, you know, we've got COVID now. I know it's going to be different with regard to funding and everything, but I have to say the evaluations of the domestic abuse matters training that's ran through England, Scotland and Wales has been very, very good, and the evaluations of same within different jurisdictions, looking at how that is impacted on the police officers. And again, as you had said, Sinead, it's about letting them try and get into the shoes of that, you know, person. How are they feeling at that time? And there's some really interesting research as well around the children in the home whenever you go out to a domestic violence incident. And Dr. Anne-Marie Miller at Queen's did a piece of research around police response. And it's just absolutely heartbreaking, because she did speak to a number of children, and going up, and one of the children said, oh, that police officer was really nice because he gave me some juice and a biscuit and let me know what was happening. Where a lot of the police officers didn't know what to do if there was a child in the house, and left them, and they didn't know what was happening, you know, and they're often the forgotten or hidden, you know, victims.
And those children probably in a really, you know, disruptive environment, and the fact that we've had no schools during lockdown means there isn't even a teacher to pick up on that, because obviously a teacher would see a distressed child, a child with no homework, a child with no uniform, and they would know something had went wrong and maybe be able to red flag that, whereas those kids are now left in a situation without that backup during that time. And I know that I've spoken to teachers who are absolutely terrified for some of the children in their class, because they haven't seen them and they haven't logged on to any of the online learning, and they don't know whether the child's safe or not. And that would have been the first protocol. And I took part in a conference about a year ago, and there was a scheme in England where if an officer was called to a domestic incident, they had to let the principal of the school know by the next morning, so that child could maybe be taken into a quiet room and asked were they okay, maybe, you know, given a teddy bear, given something to try and comfort them, and at least then the teacher would have known, whereas we don't have that here, where you imagine it should be quite simple for a school to be informed on the morning of, you know, that a child starts back if there's been a really disruptive incident in their house.
The important aspect there is whether or not the children, social services are already involved with the family. Quite frequently, if there's a domestic incident, as we all know, it crosses the board in the spectrum of society. So social services may not be involved. If you're linked into that system, the school will be aware of it. And if you're not linked into social services, and the school is unlikely to be aware of it, save that we have very good teachers. And I do have a concern that what we will see now is we will see a sharp rise when the schools return of a plethora of issues in relation to perhaps public order cases, because things have been amplified, crystallised in a family home in a way that, because parties have had to live together on an ongoing basis, there's no respite for either the parents from each other or the children. So I do think that we will see a significant increase. We've seen over the last number of weeks a significant increase in care order applications and much more serious circumstances giving rise. Police have been involved. Teachers are a key element, generally speaking, of linking in with the with gateway services. So that is a real concern, and I do think that as we progress back towards September and October, that we will again see an emergence of more cases coming through the system.
How often do you see, you know, generational abuse? So as someone who has came from an abusive home finding themselves in an abusive home?
Oh, absolutely. Well, but I'm now almost 25 years practicing, and I am, in some cases, I'm almost on the third generation of a family. So you do, of course, see, I mean, we're very aware, and I always explain to a client if they come in and they're debating whether or not to leave an abusive relationship, because we know that takes some time. And a parent should never be criticised for maybe having experienced incidents and not left the family home, because quite frequently what they'll say is, I stayed for the children. And I always think it's very important to explain to to a mother that what we understand as family lawyers, and I'm sure Sonya will understand in greater depth than I will, but what we understand is that female children replicate what they see in terms of their female role model in the family home, and male children tend to replicate their male role model. So if you have an abusive relationship and an aggressor and a victim, that's the modelling that the children see.
It's a normalisation almost of abuse, isn't it?
And I certainly have represented it's shocking and it's distressing as a professional to have represented a mother with, say, a 10 or 11-year-old daughter, and then within 5 or 6 years representing the daughter in similar circumstances.
Yeah, the Operation Encompass is what you were talking about earlier there, and the Department of Health and Justice have just released the Year 5 action plan of our domestic and sexual abuse strategy here in Northern Ireland, and that is part of it. But it came down to our old legislation around terrorism with regard to information sharing with the police and school and social services, etc. But it's something so simple that makes such a difference. We have a wonderful programme called Helping Hands, and it's in about 2/3 of the schools in Northern Ireland at the moment. And it's really a preventative education programme, and it's given children and young people, it's usually around P5-ish, the skills and tools to recognise those old feelings and what's going on for them and what makes them happy and sad. And and you have a helping hand where you have one person in each finger you can go to for support, and then one just tucked up your shirt in case a few of them go away somewhere, So it's really positive, and it's a wonderful piece of training where we actually actually train the teachers across Northern Ireland, and then they go in and take it into the classroom. Because again, I'm coming back to reports again. If we look at Gillen's report, years ago into family law review, and if we look at the criminal justice inspection again into domestic violence, time and time again, it's about education. And it's about healthy relationship programs, because we don't have relationship and sexual education training here in Northern Ireland on a statutory footing. A lot of our kids are getting their sex education on their phone, and pornography and things like that. And there's a lot of unrealistic expectations of what a relationship is and of what sex is. And in Northern Ireland, I don't think we talk about sex openly enough. Nobody does it in Northern Ireland apparently. But see, we need to be open and honest and have those conversations. But it needs to be in a statutory footing within our schools, because children aren't growing up in a healthy relationship and know about equality and trust and values and all of those really important things that you want to have in a relationship. And unfortunately as well, we see women coming into refuge as well that were in as children and then are returning again, within their own relationship. But we have to break that cycle. And again, we're letting people down. We really, really are, because we don't have enough of it all starts with young people and education and even consent and all of those issues. We can talk about those, respect, values, all of those things from a very young age and build it in.
As part of that, there was like an art project where they were letting children obviously express themselves through art, and one young boy had written, I'm not him and he's not me, because he didn't want to grow up like his father. And it's almost this inevitability that, he's going to grow up and be the same type of person. And those children, as you said, there has to be training to break that cycle and stop that continuing on.
And I suppose the positive is that a lot of children we see, and I know that particular story, it was in the film that we did, and it's so powerful because for children, that particular boy could see the image when he looked in the mirror, the reflection, and saw that. And I am not going to be him. He will, he will not define me. And I think there's so many wonderful stories that we have of children who have made that choice not to behave in that way, and have took a very different direction, which is so positive. But we do so much work with our children and young people through focus groups and everything. And I think coming back to when we're talking about, your story, Alison, it's so important. And as part of the Justice Committee evidence, we have got a number of women who will be talking to the Justice Committee, because they're the experts by experience and they need to hear the realities of what's happening. And there's not enough of that.
And when I spoke to the Justice Minister, she was so, despite the fact that it's constitutional, they were so unaware of some of the aspects. So the family court abuse, and as you would know, Sinead, he continually tried to bring me back to the family court, and I kept saying, this is nonsense. Like, I have an order to stop this man being anywhere near me, but he can take a family court, a completely, vexatious family court case, and I have to sit in the same room as him, and that's traumatizing me, and I don't want it. And I had to take a day off work, and I had to lose money.
I think there is in terms of the Department of Justice understanding of what a real person's experience of going through the domestic proceedings court is. You don't get that from coming down and sitting, as we frequently see the Department of Justice representatives coming down and sitting at the back of the domestic proceedings court. You really don't get the true experience of a victim. And so it is important that people like yourself, people that come to Women's Aid, do go and speak and tell their story, because their stories are very powerful. When and I have to say, when Naomi Long was, she was an MLA at the time, I was very concerned about the direction that the Department of Justice was going in terms of access to justice and the funding of access to justice. And I didn't think that as part of a group of lawyers that engaged with the Department of Justice, and I didn't think that they understood, or indeed that they were listening to what we were saying as a group of lawyers on behalf of our clients. That said, I found Naomi Long was very willing to listen to what I had to say, and I asked a number of my clients, could I have the permission to take their files over? I didn't want to take my clients over, but I asked, could I take their files over and could I show them to Naomi Long and go through. And as you well know, Alison, these files end up that size with people's lives in them. So she sat with me for several hours and went through several files and the stories that were writ large in those files of papers. But one of the concerns that I've always had is that part of the abuse, there's two prongs to the abuse in terms of the justice system. The first part, in my view, is that quite frequently when a woman comes into me looking for a protective order, she is the parent, and the non-resident parent, the father of the children, is, for example, getting access to state benefits. She may likewise be getting access to state benefits, but she may be the person that is out funding their uniforms, their meals, the little holidays that she may be able to afford to take them on. And so she works part-time. So she works 16 hours, she gets child and working tax credit, child benefit, and maybe housing benefit. That now acts as an absolute barrier to that woman getting legal aid. And so if she wants to seek any form of protection, if she wants to defend a children order application, she has to fund it.
And it becomes financially abusive, and I was able to pay that, but I know that some people aren't. And it didn't cost anything. So for somebody who is obsessed with someone and is stalking them, it's access to them. It means you get access to them. And it means that it was all funded. It was all funded through legal aid because he didn't work. And it was continuous. And it went on to the point where, in fact, it had to be stopped by the judge because it was so abusive. You were there. You remember that? I didn't go into the room. You went into the room.
Well, that was actually in the county court.
Yeah.
So that was an appeal from the domestic proceedings court, and there is an automatic right of appeal,
which again meant another day back in court.
Exactly.
Again.
So that forms part, and that's certainly in your case, that formed part of the abuse of the whole system. But part and parcel of that is that particular person got legal aid the whole way through. And while you didn't get legal aid to fund it.
And also I was losing money. I mean, there was days I would have been on my way around to court and got a call from Talkback or Nolan or whatever and couldn't do it. And that's money I've lost as well.
That represents a barrier to a person. In your shoes, the injured party is the person that is out financially because the system doesn't fund you. Now, there is domestic proceedings, the domestic violence scheme. Quite frequently, people are outside the domestic violence.
I don't understand how at that stage how somebody couldn't be looking at those applications and just refusing them. I mean, and I think that would be the simplest way to solve that problem. To look at that and go, is this genuine? I mean, on one occasion, he got a letter because he wanted to go to Gay Pride in Union Street. I mean, someone would have just looked at that and went, no, you're not getting legal aid for this. Wise up. And that went on and on and on. And obviously the reason this entire talk is called Why Doesn't She Just Leave is because we know that is the thing that people say, usually after someone has been murdered and has died in an abusive relationship, and you realise that there's a family history to go, well, why didn't she just leave? And we know that is the most dangerous time. I was in an abusive relationship. It was toxic, it was violent, it was all those things. And I left, and that was when this started. The stalking didn't start until I left. And then it went on and it was relentless. And I have diaries where I've written everything in, and there wasn't a week of my life for about 2 years where I didn't have to speak to the police or go to a court or speak to a solicitor or speak to the PPA or speak to someone. Like it was a constant in my life for that time. And that was because I tried to leave. And the most dangerous time for a lot of these women, and that's when a lot of the coercion comes into it. And do you think the coercive control legislation might help that?
I hope so, but again, it's the interpretation of what it is, and already people are saying that, there's real challenges, and how do you prove that, So that's, again,
it hasn't been very successful in England. There's very few cases, and there are always cases which are linked to violent abuse as well. So the person has been convicted of violence and the coercion at the side of it. I don't know of any case where, it's simply just being the coercion by itself. I think it becomes very difficult then.
It is very difficult, and I think that comes down to training. When you've police officer attending a scene, what are they going to look for? So I know that the Public Prosecution Service and the police at the moment are reviewing a number of domestic abuse files and looking at that evidence and how can they better gather that evidence. Whenever they're coming in with body-worn cameras, what questions should they be asking? What should they look for? And again, to present a better case whenever they're attending court. I think we would always call for judicial training in relation to these issues, because especially if you look at stalking, and we have case studies that we presented in the stalking legislation consultation where a man had left, the perpetrator had left left flowers at the front door. And the judge was, well, sure, what's wrong with that? Isn't that lovely? Showing a bit of remorse, but didn't understand the context of those flowers. And I've been in court, and gone down to support women, and all it has taken is that look, and they're crumbling, because that's all it takes, because they know.
Absolutely.
And so it's that understanding of...
I've had cases where in the waiting room, my clients have been intimidated by the respondent in a set of proceedings. I do think that judicial training is extremely important, because coercive control can quite frequently be very nuanced, and it's a pattern of behaviour. And sometimes those aspects of the behaviour, if you isolate them, they can seem like a nothingness, and they can be talked away by the respondent or excused. But I think that what we have to keep in mind, and what our judiciary have to keep in mind, is that you have to look at it as a collective, as a group of behaviours that, while one instant of itself may not seem to be of any significance, the terror that leaving flowers, there can be any number of interpretations as to why you would leave flowers on somebody's door
as itself, and that's the point is that you don't want them near you, and they're there.
And I think that there has to be an understanding, and we have some very, very, very good magistrates, there has to be an understanding that we have long since moved past the threat or use of violence, that and social media. I mean, when I started practice, I used to be able to say to my clients, look, don't answer the phone or change the landline number. Now I explain to my own children that mobile phones are not necessarily a great thing. On a very basic level, if you have a fight with your friend in school, that's it. When you come home, you close the front door and nobody can get access to you. Now, and the reason I understand that is because I've seen it so often with clients. Now somebody uses a mobile phone to reach into your life at all hours of the day.
And you can't get away from it, and you just can't. And my phone is such an important part of my job. I couldn't just close down my social media, because that's also part of my job. And that meant that access was constant. And I mean, there are times I still have screen grabs of the missed calls, and I would have had hundreds of them every day, and it would have been every 5 seconds, and then I was having to put my phone on silent because I just couldn't deal with it anymore.
No, it's relentless.
And it just kept going on, and it would draw until 3 o'clock in the morning. The abuse of fake Twitter accounts, it was like whack-a-mole. Like, he had hundreds of fake Twitter accounts, and I decided at one stage just to ignore them and stop reporting them to police. But that just enraged him further, because he wasn't getting a reaction then, so he had to escalate his behaviour. So it went from making accusations and saying awful things about me to saying really filthy sexual things about my daughters. And that was awful, because he thought, well, it's not annoying her anymore saying things about her, so who could I say things about that would upset her? And I mean, in some of the messages that were put under my Twitter account, and he would tag politicians into them and tag other journalists into them and make sure as many people could see them as possible. And at one point he was like sending links to porn films to my daughter on her mobile phone from a pay-as-you-go phone, saying, watch this, your mother's in it, and harassing her because he knew he wasn't getting a reaction from me. So even trying to ignore it didn't work. And I mean, to have that constant in your life and get up every morning and not know. And if I was working and I was on live TV, I had a knot in my stomach, because I knew the minute I came out that my phone and my Twitter would have been full of disgusting, filthy messages that the whole world would have been tagged in to see. And it was harassing, it was humiliating, it was all of those things. And as you're saying, in isolation, when you're phoning the police, they're going, that sounds quite minor, and I'm going, but you need to look at what this is part of, this is part.
We would talk about domestic terrorism, and looking at, whenever we do training, the comparisons to prisoners of war, of torture, and, those kind of psychological training and things that happen that are so impactful. But a case that brings into light the coercive and controlling behaviour is the case of Luke and Ryan Hart. The two brothers, yes, and their mother and sister were murdered by the father. Now, they had just got them into a private rented property the week before, but they had a very strict routine, and they went swimming to a certain swimming pool, and he shot them in the car park and then took his own life. And there was never a physical incident in that home, but the boys talked about it being like methane gas. He isolated them, moved them out into the middle of the country, and everything was so regimented in the routine of their life as children. And I think that highlights how high risk it is of coercive and controlling behaviour, not one physical incident, because there didn't
Clodagh
need to
Hall
be.
case again, the same, this pillar of the community, no physical violence, but clearly very coercive. And I thought whenever the sister of Clodagh Hall spoke, and she said that he came with them to buy the dresses, and he insisted on walking her down the aisle rather than somebody else and all of that. And you could see that is complete and utter control of a person's life. And that is abuse without bruises, and that can be as mentally damaging and draining as physical abuse.
Well, whenever you talk to women, that's what they say, because it's like a drip, drip, drip. Every day, you're crap, you're useless, whatever it may be that's happening. But, and they lose that whole sense of self.
Absolutely.
Which is really, they say someone got into a relationship 10 years ago and they just don't know who to see in the mirror, who they are anymore. And, for some women, I just don't know where they get the strength to actually make that move and get out. But often it is the final straw, can be something very small.
Absolutely.
But it's just that
Totally,
tip them over.
totally. I had a case, I'll not go into specifics, but it was quite a horrendous physical assault, and the lady didn't do anything, and her daughter had witnessed the assault. A couple of weeks later, she was walking down the road and he was walking up the other side of the road, and he shouted a name across at her, and that was the final straw for her. So the physical assault didn't motivate her to deal with it. And I think that has to be, I hope from this presentation that we encourage a lot more women to understand that, for example, I had a case where a lady, if she turned on the tap, he turned it off. If she poured out a glass of wine, he took it and poured it down the sink. If she went to the toilet, he stood outside the toilet door. And I've related that was one of the first ever cases I had under the Family Homes and Domestic Violence. So you're talking back in 1998. I still use that as an example to clients, and the number of clients say that's almost a mirror image of what is happening to me. So I hope that when we're doing this, that we are giving women an opportunity to understand that maybe what is happening to them is not the norm, because they almost become conditioned into thinking that this type of behaviour is acceptable, and it is the norm. And it can be a very, very minor incident that causes the trigger for them to say that's enough. We had a lady recently where for 19 years she suffered domestic abuse and eventually broke free of it. But it took her 19 years to do so. And none of us should criticise anybody for staying there that long. But as a positive to the narratives that we're relating here, certainly when I see a client coming in, you can see their shoulders down, their physical appearance altered from what they may have been 10 years ago. But when we take them through the process, and I hope, Alison, that this is reflective of your experience.
I'm sure that the first day you seen me, I was a shadow of myself. I didn't know what I was going to do, and I felt so ashamed as well, because I kept thinking this is a reflection on me, and I'm meant to be a security correspondent. I deal with like paramilitaries, criminals, police, and everything, and I'm letting this, pathetic person really bully my life, and why am I allowing this to happen? And there was days in that family where I thought I was going to vomit. I was so nervous and so sick. And now when I look back at it, I think, who even was she? Like, who was that person now? Because and there been days when I would have been walking to work, and for weeks he stood just outside the 100 metres he wasn't allowed in, and just stood there every morning. He didn't speak or say anything. He just stood there as I was coming into work, and the police were like, well, he's not breaking his order, there's nothing we can do. And that was repetitive. And there was so many times like that where they said, we can't prosecute that because he hasn't done anything. But I'm like, walk a different way to work. So I started walking a different way to work, and he figured that out, and then stood the different way I was walking to work, but just outside of where he was allowed to be. And that would have went on for so long. He'd have knew what time I took my lunch at, and he'd have stood, so I couldn't even walk up to the shop to buy a sandwich at lunchtime because I knew he'd have been there. And that was constant. And I would have had friends phoning me going, don't come out of your office. He's literally standing, at the top of the street.
But I hope at the other side of the process that you have, that working with people like ourselves and all the supports that you had, that on the other side of that, you have regained who you are.
It does, and I think it made me a better journalist, because now when I'm covering those sort of cases, I can see all the ins and outs of it, and not just look at it in a black and white or some sort of binary way. You can see that there's so many, there's complexities to cases, and there's shade to them, and you don't understand until you've actually been, in that situation and hear for yourself that there's.
I think that is a positive message, and while there are a lot of negatives and there's a lot of work to be done. I do think that there are a lot of supports out there, and while we do have to battle on behalf of our clients, and we do have to get involved with the police and point out that, you know, maybe you haven't done that correctly and we've had to go to the police ombudsman, at the same time, they shouldn't act as barriers to people coming forward to seek the supports that are currently there. Yes, we can do things better. The justice system can do things better. We can look at funding education programmes for the police and funding access to justice. But there are supports there, and we do help people to the other side of it and walk through with, of course, Women's Aid, which is a tool that we frequently rely upon and direct our clients towards, and likewise Women's Aid direct clients towards us as family practitioners. But I would like to think that, and I know that on the other side of cases, I have seen people transform. I've seen their complexions change, their shoulders back, their confidence regained. And I think that's very, very important, that we let people know that while it may be bad now, and if people are watching this and thinking that is me, that they should get help, because you can be transformed. Your life can turn around.
It completely just changed, and no matter how long it took, and it took, in my case, it took a very long time. Every time they do something, the path narrows a little bit on them, do you know what I mean? And so they become more and more exposed. So at the start, he was very skilled at lying his way out of it. But by the end, everyone who he tried to lie to could see that he was a liar, because he had narrowed his path so much. And they do. And, you know, and I'd said that because after, and the only reason why I did speak about it was because I was interviewing a girl, Ciara. She was a lovely young girl who'd been stalked. And I thought afterwards, like, I'm asking her to bare her soul to tell her story, and I don't have the balls to tell mine because I was still so ashamed of it. I thought, like, how can I ask other people to speak about this when I won't speak about it? And that was part of it. But also by doing that and taking it out of the shadows, that again took away some of his power, because he thought because of what I did for a living, I would never speak about it publicly, that I would be too ashamed. And once you've done that, you remove that last bit of power, because you say, I'm not ashamed anymore. And you just show that, I mean, it doesn't mean a person is weak, you know.
And I think yourself sharing the story, speaking to women afterwards, you gave other people a voice, because they thought that could not happen to you, that strong woman that you see, you know. And so it made it real. And I think when people do share those stories very openly, it does give people a voice to think, well, okay, maybe I could talk to someone. And of all the years whenever I worked on the helpline, it was always the same. People would ring and, oh, look, I don't think I've rang the right place, because, you know, I've never been hit, and I don't even know why I've rang, you know. And then 20 minutes in, you know, they've been pushed down the stairs. They've had numerous assaults. And again, as I said previously, they've lost that whole sense of who they are and their self-confidence and everything, you know. So, but it's just that one time, you know, picking up that phone, making that call, and you're opening it up. So there is a real sense of, this is real now. I have to accept this, where sometimes it's easier just, you know, as they say, opening a can of worms, you are, because you have to admit to it, you have to talk to about it. And I think there is so much.
And I hate that word even, you know, to think that, you know, because it makes it sound like, you know, you've done something wrong.
You've done something
blame,
wrong.
yeah.
And that's why there's so much talk and challenge around that victim survivor kind of. But you talked about the shame and the guilt, you know, and the secrecy that surrounds, you know, this form of abuse. For many women, they've never told anybody, you know, but who would believe me? Sure, he's a great fella and everybody thinks he's wonderful,
yeah.
You know, and that's, again, whenever you speak to people, it's like they're talking about the same man. You know, it's the same kind of, you know, do they all go to the perpetrator school of domestic abuse?
I actually said it, and many people contacted me after I spoke, and honestly, there must be a stalking school somewhere, because the exact same patterns of behaviour, you know, the abuse of the family court, then the making vexatious police claims against people, you know, the online abuse, all of it, it's as if there's a training school somewhere for these people, because the pattern of behaviour are so similar.
They really are. But I think, Sinead, it's such an important message that there is support out
Absolutely.
there. And there's a wonderful, we were talking about children, their poetry and their art and their pieces of work. And there was a wonderful poem by a young woman, and she talked about the light at the end of the tunnel. It's a very long tunnel, but, you know, I can see the light now. And I think it's those stories of hope and change that we don't hear enough of. And there is a lot of support there. It's difficult. And as Monica McWilliams always talked about, it's not a process, it's not an event, it's a process, it takes time. And sometimes you are, a few steps forward one day and then you will be many steps back, but it's about keeping going there and getting as much support as you can. And I think for a lot of people, I heard Sammy Woodhouse speak, one of the young women in the Rotherham case of child sexual exploitation. And something has always stuck with me of what she said. And whenever you're believed, the sooner you're believed, the sooner you start to heal. And that's why it's so important whenever you do speak to someone that they believe you, they acknowledge what's happened to you, and it's really good for you to be able to move on. And so many people after that, I've heard them say that, and that's so important for any of us who are providing support, and even as a family solicitor, to show that empathy and understanding, and not be dismissive, because that makes such a difference. That acknowledgement, that police person, that first responder, are you okay? And to believe and acknowledge and accept, what you're hearing. That's so important.
I think we all have in assisting somebody through that journey, we all play our individual roles, and it's important for us as family lawyers to say to the person, we'll stand in front of you, we'll act as your barrier, we will take the application for you and take you through the process. And that's very, very comforting for them. They need to know that they have a strong advocate for them at a time when they don't have a voice. They need to know that we give them that voice and then signpost them to the other supports. For example, the Women's Aid Journey to Freedom programme. I have always found that to be very, very helpful. And I know that I've sent numerous clients to undertake that course. And counselling is very, very important for them to understand that somebody is there to listen to them while we're taking them through the journey of the court process. And I know it's not ideal.
No, and I think just as you're saying, because I think we're more or less running out of time, but that advocacy part, and we know that was in Gillen, and I think it's just recently they said that there's only 11% of the recommendations have even been dealt with. Obviously we've had no assembly, hopefully, but there was 2 recommendations that stuck out in that report for me because I thought that they hit home. One was that Gillen had said if you are a criminal solicitor who has defended someone in a case of rape or sexual abuse, you have to go under specialist training or you will not be entitled to the legal aid. And I know for you, Sinead, you're a family court lawyer and that's your expertise, but then you get solicitors who represent people in the criminals court coming into basically your area and they're not trained to do that, and their behaviour can be so damaging and they become part of the abuse. And also that obviously with the criminal court, I do believe there should be legal aid for people to have someone like you by their side to guide them through that process, because people don't understand. They kept saying to me, well, did your solicitor not say this? And I go, well, I don't have one. I'm literally a witness for the state now. That's all I am.
I'm just a witness. A lot of people don't know. They go, well, who's there to support me? And they think the public prosecution is their person, and you're only a witness in a case. And again, that's around the communication. And we've worked a lot with the PPS to say a letter isn't good enough. You need to explain this process. And again, in Gillen, in relation to serious sexual offences, and in the domestic abuse bill in relation to domestic violence, we're the only part of the UK, again, that doesn't have an independent domestic violence advocate associated with our multi-agency risk assessment conferences for high-risk cases of domestic violence. And it shows that whenever you do have an advocate, more people see the case through to the end, because there's a huge amount of withdrawals, but there's an awful lot of issues around that.
Somebody's going to stay informed, because only for work in the courts. Court reporters would have been saying to me, don't you know that he was up for bail or something today? And nobody had ever told me that.
No,
and I
you never get that information.
And I would never have known.
I think
otherwise.
I think it is what you get from engaging in the civil process. Whether you're a fee-paying client or a legally aided client, you get a solicitor that either walks shoulder to shoulder with you or actually a couple of steps ahead of you. So acting as a shield and a barrier and a guide. And you don't get that in the criminal justice process. Now, I have numerous clients that are running proceedings or running in tandem. So much like yourself, we would have spoken quite regularly about what was happening in the criminal end of your case, and we will try and guide them through that. But our role is very, very limited. It is, in my view, very, very important that the standard the standard and quality of service that you get from a private law family solicitor or any sort of advocate is there in what is possibly the worst time of your life, to go through the criminal justice system as an injured party, and not to have that guiding hand with you.
But as you say, Sinead, they are going, you may be in the family court, in the criminal court, you've child contact cases going, you've an order, you've so much going on, and they're not talking to each other, the systems, with regard to that. So I think there's an awful lot of joint up working can be done as well.
And the problem with that is getting the funding for that and getting the funding for obviously. And I know she had said that Women's Aid do try and provide that, but I think, having a solicitor with you in the criminal court just to advise you on your legal rights and also what is going to happen here. This is what this process is going to be. This is, you're going to have to go in, you're going to have to give evidence, then he is going to have to give evidence. And even that in itself, can be traumatizing because they can use the given evidence as part of the abuse. And the absolute
re-victimization
nonsense that, was thrown out during the appeal of my case. He got up and used it as part of the abuse and made all sorts of mad, wild allegations about me while giving evidence, which was just part of the abuse again. And he couldn't even stop himself from doing that. And you can see, if you were a woman sitting there with no one else to help you advise, you'd be going, why is he allowed to do that?
You'd run out the door.
You would withdraw from it, and quite frequently we see that.
And that's why we have the continued high rates of withdrawal and people not going through, And I think that independent advocate, it would make your role easier as well. You need to have that support there. But they are piloting a domestic violence court, and Judge Bagnall is doing that in Belfast. So we welcome that. And there will be an advocate as part of that court.
That's key.
And it would be so helpful not even just have that court as a closed domestic violence court, because that is another part of that is the embarrassment of having your entire business in the middle of a criminal court full of all the comings and goings that's going on in there. Even that in itself would be terrifying. Whereas at least if you thought that there was some privacy awarded to, what is an awful time in some people's lives.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the recommendations in Gillill, albeit for serious sexual offences,
but they do translate,
They
do
really do apply
they
to
do.
criminal court for domestic violence cases in relation to that public, arena that we saw so openly within that Belfast trial. And I think that's so important, the advocacy as well. But the public hearing and, everybody were coming down on a day trip to go into the court to see what's happening.
I covered that case, and because there was such press interest, they moved part of the press box into the public gallery and just put like a rope between it. So I was sitting in the public gallery watching people, and it was like a reality TV show. They were practically showing up with popcorn. And on the day that the complainant in that case was given evidence, and it was very graphic and it was very sexual, there was a man sitting beside me who was in his element. He was laughing and holding and rubbing his legs and, this is great, and they got her there. And I couldn't understand why it was allowed to go on. And as probably we all did, I spoke to Gil, and as did lots of other members of the press who covered that case, and explained that to him. And I also asked at that time why it was put in the biggest court in Larkin to facilitate that. And he says, well, they knew there'd be a lot of public interest in it. And I was like, surely that was more of a reason to put it in the smallest court.
It was a social media service.
Yes, it was. It was insane. And you have no privacy and you have no anonymity. And her name was mentioned 20 times a day.
Repeatedly. Everybody knew the injured party's name. You have, on the one hand, calls for family courts to be opened up. But that case is a very, very good example of why, in my view, family courts should be entirely private. Our domestic courts are private. The criminal
I do think there's a case for some of the judgments in the domestic courts being published, anonymised online, so that people can see the reason for them, but not to allow people to go in and spectate on that. That's wee children's lives.
The bulk of domestic proceedings runs through the domestic proceedings court, which is not a court of record. And so I think I can't remember an occasion whenever I've had, maybe in a children order case, domestic violence has been an aspect in the High Court, but I don't, in my length of practice, I don't recall any domestic cases that I've ever had reaching High Court level. So the highest level you're going to get to is on appeal to the Family Care Centre, which is, of course, a court of record, but you're appealing the lower court's decision. So the bulk of the evidence will have been dealt with in a court that's not a court of record, and therefore you're highly unlikely ever to get a written judgment published in a domestic case. But in my view, there's very strong arguments why we should protect injured parties. Because we also have to acknowledge that there are children involved here, and we live in a very small community.
Yeah. And it's easy to identify people even, and baile. Look, I think that we lasted a full hour. We could probably spoke for another hour in relation to it. But listen, thank you so much for your time. I find talking about this myself, I find therapeutic. So I hope people listening to it find it in some way helpful. Okay, thanks very much.
Thanks, Alison.